Thanks for watching Lessons in Minutes with Jaylee. Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe.
Today's lesson will focus on a worked example of limiting factor, which is a short-term decision. An introduction to limiting factor was done in a previous lesson. If you have missed that one, the link is in the description below. Let's focus on the question. National Bakery Limited makes three types of bread: white bread, brown bread, and multigrain bread. All three products are made from a material called yeast. Plant production is as follows: white bread 5,000 units, brown bread 4,000 units, and multigrain bread 3,500 units. The following information is given for the products. Selling price per unit of white bread is $510, brown bread $528, and multigrain bread is $422 per unit. Direct material per unit, 10 kg for white bread, 9 kg brown bread, and 7 kg for multigrain bread. Direct labor hours per unit of white bread is 4 hours, brown bread is 5 hours, and multigrain bread is 4.5 hours. Direct material costs $25 per kg, and direct labor is paid at a rate of $30 per hour. Fixed expenses amount to $450,000. National Bakery Limited has discovered that the yeast is in short supply and only 100,000 kg can be obtained. So this is basically saying that the limiting factor for the bread is yeast. Prepare a production plan that will make the most profit from the available material, clearly showing the contribution margin to be generated from each type of bread. In terms of limiting factor analysis, to optimize profitability in the face of limited resources, a company producing multiple products should prioritize those that generate the highest contribution per unit of the scarce resource. And we're seeing that for National Bakery, for the production of the bread, the scarce resource, which is a limiting factor, is yeast. Now, this involves ranking products based on their contribution margin and planning production to concentrate the limited resources on the highest ranking products. And you're going to see that coming out in our workings, where we're going to be ranking the products, ranking those bread based on their contribution margin so that we can plan the production of the bread, ensuring that the business meets the highest contribution margin possible. This strategy ensures efficient resource utilization and maximizes overall profit for the company. Let's look at the first step that we're going to take, and that is to calculate the contribution per unit for each product. Now, in order to calculate the contribution, it is the selling price per unit minus the variable cost per unit. So in order for you to get contribution margin, that's the sales less the variable cost. And in order for us to do that, remember, we have three types of products, and we're going to be calculating the contribution margin for each product. So remember, that's white bread, brown bread, and multigrain bread. And again, remember the formula is sales per unit minus variable cost per unit. So let's move into doing our calculation, and we need to pick up our selling price per unit, and we're going back to the question to do that. For the white bread, it is $510 per unit, brown bread is $528, and the multigrain bread is $422 per unit. So we're going to enter that in our table. So white is 510, brown 528, and the multigrain is 422. Now we're going back to the question because we need to pick up our variable cost based on the formula. We have our selling price, so we're going to pick up our variable cost. So remember, we need to less variable cost. And based on the question, our variable cost items are direct material and direct labor. Let's look at the direct material first. For white bread, it's 10 kg per unit, and the cost price per direct material is $25 per kg. So to get the direct material cost for the white bread, it's a 10 kg multiplied by the cost per unit of $25. And that gives us a value of $250. So let's enter that in our workings. So that is direct material cost for white bread is $250. How did we arrive by that? The 10 kg per unit for white bread multiplied by the cost per unit, which is $25, and that gives us $250 for white bread. Let's look at that for the brown bread. And it's 9 kg per unit, and we're going to multiply that by the $25 per kg, and that gives us a value of $225 for the brown bread direct material cost. For multigrain, we're seeing that it is 7 kg per unit, so that's 7 kg multiplied by $25 per unit, and that is $175. That is 25 multiplied by the 7 kg, and that gives us $175. Now that we have the direct material costs in our workings, we're going to pick up that for the direct labor. And for direct labor, for white bread, we're seeing 4 hours per unit, and the cost price per unit, which is the rate that is paid per hour for direct labor, is $30. So this 4 hours multiplied by $30 per hour give us the direct labor costs for the white bread. So 4 times 30 give us a value of $120. Let's pick up that relating to bran. And for bran, it is 5 hours. And remember, it is at a rate of $30 per hour. So that is going to give us a value of $150 for the bran. And let's move into the multigrain. For the multigrain, it takes 4.5 hours to produce 1 unit. The rate per hour for labor hours is $30. So 4.5 hours multiplied by 30, and that gives us a value of $135 for direct labor for the multigrain bread. So now that we have our selling price and we have our variable cost, we're now going to produce the contribution per unit. So for the white, the selling price is $510, and we're going to minus the direct material cost and the direct labor cost, and that gives us a value of $140 for the contribution per unit of white bread. For the bran, it is the selling price of $528, subtract direct material cost of $225, and direct labor costs, which are the variable costs. And that gives us a value of $153 for the contribution per unit for bran. And let's move into the multigrain. $422 selling price, subtract the variable costs of direct material of $175 and the direct labor cost, which is also a variable cost of $135. That gives us a value of $112 for the contribution margin for multigrain. Now that we have completed step 1, we're going to move into step 2, which requires us to calculate the contribution per limiting factor for each product. And to get the contribution per limiting factor for each product, that is the contribution per unit. And remember, this was calculated in step 2, and we're going to divide that by the limiting factor per unit. Now, just a reminder, the limiting factor for this business in producing the bread is the yeast, and the yeast right there is a direct material. So basically, we're going to be dividing the contribution per unit that we calculated in step 1 by the direct material per unit for each product. So let's begin with that for the white bread. And the contribution per unit of white bread, back to step 1, that is $140. So That 140 will be divided by the limiting factor of 10. And this will give us a result of $14 per kg of material. So what we're seeing is that the limiting factor per unit of white bread is $14. Let's move into that for the bran bread. And remember to calculate, it is a contribution per unit divided by the limiting factor per unit. The contribution per unit for bran bread is $153. And we're going to divide this 153 by the limiting factor of 9 kg. So it's 153 divided by the 9 kg, and that gives us a result of $17 per kg of material. So we're seeing that the bran bread contribution per limiting factor is $17 per kg. Let's move into the other type of bread, which is multigrain. And remember, to get the limiting factor, contribution per limiting factor is a contribution per unit divided by the limiting factor per unit. So the contribution per unit for multigrain is $112, and we're going to divide that by the limiting factor of 7 kg. Why are we dividing by the 7 kg? Remember, our limiting factor is the yeast, which is a direct material. So let's look at that result. 112 divided by the limiting factor of 7 kg gives us $16 per kg of material. So remember, step 1, we generated contribution per unit. And in step 2, we calculate the contribution per limiting factor for each product, where the formula is contribution per unit divided by the limiting factor per unit. And now that we have completed step 2, let's move into our next step, which is step 3. And step 3 requires that we rank products based on their contribution margin to concentrate the limited resources on the highest ranking products. Now, what do we use to determine the highest ranking products? The information that we generated in step 2 is what we will use. And just a reminder, based on step 2, the contribution per limiting factor for white bread is $14 per kg. We're seeing bran bread at $17 per kg, while the multigrain is $16 per kg, which is a limiting factor per kg of the limiting factor of yeast. Now, this information is what we're going to use to determine which one is given priority in order of production based on the limiting factor. And we are going to select the one that gives the highest contribution per limiting factor first. And based on our comparison, bran bread has the highest contribution per limiting factor. So bran bread should be produced first because we're selecting the items that will give the business the highest contribution margin. No, we have 16 and we have 14 remaining. 16 is for the multigrain, and that is higher than the contribution that the business will be generating from the white bread. So therefore, multigrain bread will be produced second if there's any material left after producing the bran bread. And if there's any of that scarce resource remaining, which is the yeast, what will be produced next is the white bread. But bear in mind that only what the limiting factor can produce, that is what you produce, is a possibility that the business may not be able to produce all of the units for the white bread. So any amount that yeast can produce for the white bread, the material remaining can produce, that is what will be produced. Now, this information that we have here in step 3 determines how we should produce the items. And having that information, we're going to move into the final stage where we look at preparing a production plan. So for this, we're going to show the units for each product that will be produced, the material required, how much material is needed to produce that amount of units, and we're going to generate a contribution that the business will generate from producing those products. All right, so based on our previous stage, we see that the bran bread should be given priority in being produced first. And why? Because the contribution per limiting factor is higher than the others. So we are going to look at producing the bran bread first. Now, based on the question, the business planned to produce 4,000 units. And Just a reminder, the business only has 100,000 of kg of yeast, which is the limiting factor. Once we get to the 100,000 mark, then that is where the production will stop. So we cannot produce more than what we have the yeast, more than the yeast that is available. All right, so once we get to the 100,000 kg of material, then the production has to stop. So let's see if we're able to produce everything that the business planned to produce. So again, we're going to begin with the bran bread, and the business planned to produce 4,000 units. And we are going to enter that information in our workings. So let's get to that. The number of units to be produced for bran bread is 4,000. All right. Now, the material required, we have to enter that. And to produce a 4,000 bran bread, we need to know how much material the business will be using, or how much yeast the business will be using. Based on the question, we are seeing that it is 9 kg per unit. So it is 4,000 units multiplied by the 9 kg, and that is going to give us the material that is required to produce the bran bread. So let's move into that. So again, 4,000 multiplied by the 9 kg, and that gives us a value of 36,000 material that is required. So it's 36,000 kg that will be used to produce the 4,000 units. How did we get the 36? It's the 4,000 units multiplied by the 9 kg per unit, and that gives us 36,000. Now that we have that information, let's see the contribution that the business will be generating from producing the 4,000 bran bread. Now, in step 1, we had calculated the contribution to be generated from producing 1 unit of the items. And for the bran bread, it is $153 per unit of bran bread. This $153 will be used to aid us in calculating the contribution that the business will be generating from producing the 4,000 units. So that is 4,000 multiplied by the $153, and that gives us a value of $612,000 in contribution that the business will be generating from producing the 4,000 units of bran bread. There's another method that could be used, and that is to use the material required multiplied by the contribution per limiting factor, which is $17, and that will still give you the value of $612,000. So whether you want to use the number of units multiplied by the contribution margin per unit to get the contribution margin, or you want to use the material required multiplied by the limiting factor per unit, you'll still get the result of $612,000 for the contribution margin where the business will be producing the bran bread. So that will be the contribution margin the business will be generating from producing the 4,000 bran bread. Now that we have that, let's look at what should be produced next. So based on the ranking, the multigrain bread should be produced next. Okay, so let's make a note of that. All right, now we need a number of units that the business need to produce or plan to produce. And that information comes from the question again. And based on the question for the multigrain, the business plan to produce 3,500 units. So we're going to enter that details in our worksheet. And that is 3,500 units. Now onto the material required. And again, we have to ensure that we're not exceeding the 100,000 kg of the limiting factor, which is the yeast, the material that is available. So far, based on our production plan, we would have used up 36,000 kg of material. So what we have left is 64,000 kg of material remaining. So remember, we cannot exceed 100,000 kg of material. Now for the multigrain bread, let's determine the material required. And we have to go back to the question to some information. So it's 3,500 units. And to produce 1 unit of the multigrain bread, it is 7 kg. So that is going to be, for the material required, the 3,500 units multiplied by the 7 kg. And that gave us a result of 24,500 kg of yeast material that is required to produce the multigrain bread. So let's enter that details in our worksheet. So that is 24,500. How did we arrive by the 24,500? Remember, 3,500 units, and that is multiplied by the 7 kg per unit, and that gives us 24,500 material that is required to produce the multigrain. Now let's look at the contribution. And remember, there are two ways in generating the contribution that the business will be generating from producing the units. You can use the units multiplied by the contribution margin per unit, or you can use the material required and multiply that by the limiting factor per unit. So 3,500 units, and if we go back to step 1, we see that the business would generate a contribution of $112 to produce 1 unit. So our result is the 3,500 multiplied by the $112 per unit for the contribution, and that will give us a result of $392,000. If it is that you use the material required, that route in generating the contribution, remember, you would have to use the 24,500. You would multiply this by the $16 per kg, and that will still give you the result of $392,000 for the contribution. All right, so now that we have calculated the contribution margin that the business will generate from producing the multigrain, the 3,500 multigrain bread, we are now going to move into the next item that will fall in the ranking for production, and that is the white bread. And let's make a note of that we are onto the white bread. So we're entering that in our production plan. Now, before we go any further, we need to check how much material we have available. Remember that the limiting factor is 100,000 kg of material, and that is found in our question, 100,000 kg. Now let's look at what we would have used up so far as it relates to the material required in our production plan. So we have recorded that we would produce the bran bread first, the multigrain, and in total, the material that would have used up so far is 36,000 for the bran and 24,500 for the multigrain, which gives us a total of 60,500 kg of material that is already used up. And if we have only 100,000 and we would have used up 60,500, it means that what we have available is only 39,500. How did we get that 39,000? We add up what we used up before, which is the 36 and the 24,500, and that gives us a value of 60,500. We subtract that 60,500 from the total number of limiting factor that we have available, which is a 100,000, and that gives us 39,500. Now, guess what, people? Because we only have 39,500 of material available, it looks as if we cannot produce all the units that the business plans to produce for the white bread. Let's go back to the question. So the business actually planned to produce 5,000 units of white bread. But again, we're not sure if the business is able to produce the 5,000 given the fact that there is only 39,500 kg of material is left. So in order to determine how much white bread the business can produce, we have to look at the amount of kg it takes to produce 1 unit of white bread. In this case, we're seeing 10 kg of material to produce 1. So if it is 10 kg to produce 1, and the business only has available in material remaining 39,500. It means that we're going to divide this 39,500 by the kg, the 10 kg, to get the number of units of white bread that the business can produce. And we're only seeing that the business is able to produce 3,950 units of white bread. How did we arrive by that? The 39,500 kg of material that is left divided by the 10 kg to produce one white bread, and that 10 kg, remember, that is coming from the question. We are seeing that the business is only able to produce 3,950 white bread. So based on the limiting factor, the business cannot produce the 5,000 units of white bread that it planned to produce. Now, let us determine the contribution that the business will be able to generate from the production of the 3,950 white bread. And we are going back to the first step where we generated the contribution per unit. And for the white bread, we're seeing that that is $140 per one white bread. So the business is able to generate $140 per unit of white bread. It means that our contribution margin, or the business contribution margin that it will be able to generate from producing the 3,950 white bread is $553,000 in contribution that the business will be generating. How did we get this? Remember, it's the number of units, which is 3,950, that is multiplied by the contribution per unit of $140, and that gives us the value of $553,000 in contribution margin that the business will generate from producing the 3,950 white bread. Remember as well that you could use the material required, and if it is that you use the root of the material required, it would be the 39,500 material multiplied by the limiting factor per unit that was generated in step 2, and that limiting factor per unit for the white bread is $14 per kg. So it will be the $14 per kg multiplied by the 39,500, and that will give you $553,000. So now that we have determined the order in which we will produce, we have recorded the units, the material required, and the contribution that will be generated from producing each product, we are now going to enter our total. So the total material used up is 100,000. How did we arrive by that? The 36,000 plus the 24,500 plus the 39,500, and that gives us 100,000. Our contribution that the business will be generating is $1,557,000. So you add up the 612, the 392, and the 553,000, that give you $1,557,000. Now, back to the question. We're seeing that the business fixed expenses amounted to $450,000 for the period. We're now going to determine the profit that the business will be generating. So having calculated the contribution margin, remember, the business will make a contribution margin of $1,557,000 from producing the items in order based on the production plan. And we're going to less the fixed expenses from that, which is $450,000. It means that the business will be generating a profit of $1,107,000. And that takes us to the end of applying the concept of limiting factor, where you have to take into consideration how you'll be producing so that the business will make the highest contribution possible from its limiting factor.
Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe.